Historian Dominic Selwood has taken on the task of looking through 950 years of British history for his new book. A History of British Identity in 50 Objects explores how our country has changed over time, and it features objects that hail from right here in Berkshire. He's with us on the show this afternoon. I was surprised at how many are part of this, Dominic. Why did you want to do this in the first place?
Well, it started really the last couple of years, just the way Britain has been thinking about itself, not only with the Brexit referendum thoughts, but also with the statue wars, which have been very prevalent and in our newspapers a lot. I just started thinking, well, what is this telling us about the way, Britons think about what it means to be British? And I wanted to investigate that. And I thought, well, one of the best ways of doing that would be to look back at all of British history and say, well, what have we been at different times? And what have we thought of ourselves in those different moments? And in doing that, I came across so many really, really fascinating things, some of which, as you say, come from Berkshire. But the book is about the whole of Britain. So there's lots about all of it. But it's amazing how each county really has contributed, in one way or another, or in multiple ways, to the history of the country and the way we've built up our sense of who we are.
And the idea of doing this through objects, through documents, I suppose brings it to life so much more. So let's go through some of them now with obvious links to Berkshire. I mean, the oldest song in the English language has links certainly to Reading, doesn't it? And that features within the book.
That's absolutely right. So it's a wonderful song. People may know it. Sumer Is Icumen In. You hear it every now and then. It's certainly available on YouTube. If you haven't, it's well worth going and having a listen. But so that goes back to the medieval period, and it's the oldest folk song, not only in England, but actually in Europe. And it's lovely. I think it's also delightful that it still gets performed. You still hear choirs and, villages doing it every now and then. And that's direct 800 years of tradition that's still with us.
Yes, and written at Reading Abbey, which localises it so much. And one of the other things that you feature in the book is a set of sketches which were created for Queen Victoria. Tell me a little bit more about these.
So these are fascinating because some people may remember the 1960s film, which has one of Michael Caine's earliest roles, and it shows him as a young officer commanding in Zululand a famous battle that a lot of people know about, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And that is remembered often, or at least has been until recently, as a notable event in the history of the British Empire, because against huge odds, a small detachment of British soldiers, in the film they're all Welsh, that wasn't actually the case, defends themselves against a vast army of Zulu and is successful. But actually, in reality, that wasn't the case at all. There had just been an unbelievably catastrophic massacre of British soldiers by the Zulus at Isandlwana, and over 1,300 were killed. And so people didn't like reading this over their cornflakes in the morning. And so they desperately looked for a good news story. And the good news story they found was that later that day and the following day, there was this event at Rorke's Drift, which actually was militarily not significant at all, but it was a story of heroism and defending against great odds, which always makes for good media copy. And so one of the commanding officers there, not the one played by Michael Caine, but the other one, John Chard, his name was, Lieutenant John Chard, he was invited by Queen Victoria to Windsor, and twice actually, and he took with him sketches that he'd done of the battle, and you can Google them, and they're absolutely beautiful. They're in the book, but they're really quite like something out of Narnia or those sort of Victorian children's books. They're beautifully done with these sort of light wash colours, but it's dramatic because there are a sequence of them, and they show with blobs, different coloured blobs, the different forces, encroaching and closing in on the little hospital and the little compound and being completely surrounded. It's incredibly dramatic. So I picked one of those sketches because not only are they lovely in themselves, but actually, empire is such an important debate now because we're really rethinking, what did it mean when Britain had an empire? And I guess in the past, people sort of lazily thought, well, it was sort of Victoria and great railway stations and all that sort of thing, but now we're actually questioning much more, what was the human cost of that? What was the cost for the countries that we colonized? And actually something like Rorke's Drift is a really interesting way into that discussion.
Let's talk about the Magna Carta now, or certainly the origins of the Magna Carta, Dominic, which obviously have firm foundations in our area.
Absolutely. So, Magna Carta is one of those fascinating things that we think it's one thing, but actually it's another thing. So often when all the celebrations come round, and, these are very grand and nationwide and often international, we look back at this as one of the founding documents of the British Constitution and the British way of life. But in reality, it was the opposite of that. There was a very tense situation between John and his barons. Effectively, there was a civil war was about to erupt, and Magna Carta effectively is the peace treaty by which the barons say to John, "Listen, well, we won't take over the country as long as you grant the following things." But actually, it didn't work. It failed. Within 9 weeks, it had been ripped up and was thrown in the bin, and they were at civil war. And actually, they called over a Frenchman, Louis, and installed him as king instead in London. So it was a catastrophic failure. It was reissued several times again in the medieval period by kings who thought it was a nice way to appease the barons, but they'd taken out all of the teeth. So really, it didn't make many concessions. And lots of the things in there were law anyway, like the right to trial by your peers. That was already the law of the country, and in fact didn't apply to every English person. It really only applied to the Norman barons, and also only to the men, not to the women. So we have a strange idea of it, but it was resurrected in the 1600s by lawyers who were trying to curb the excesses of the Stuarts, and then in the 1700s, American lawyers who were beginning to found the different states in America. They thought it looked great, really, for stressing their independence from the English crown. So they bigged it up as this sort of vastly important document. So, later centuries made it something that actually it kind of wasn't. If you look at the intervening medieval centuries, I don't know, pick the Tudors, Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, for example. I mean, they murdered thousands, without trial, just because they felt like it. Magna Carta meant nothing to them. So, it's lovely to celebrate as a document, and it was absolutely important in the reign of John and in the history of the evolution of sort of parliamentary power. But it wasn't, a core founding document of this country that's always been respected.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Just how a history really reworks how impactful some of these things were. I mean, one thing that you cannot deny are the diary entries of Thomas Cromwell. This is really interesting because they are written in his hand. Tell us what they reveal.
So yes, and it gave me shivers down my spine just reading them and holding it in my hand, because he was Henry VIII's chief minister, as many people will know from the Wolf Hall series by Hilary Mantel, where he's portrayed as this genteel, honourable, hardworking, loyal, noble sort of servant. The reality is he was an absolutely despotic psychopath. He was one of the most unpleasant people you would ever like to meet. He was greedy, he was grasping, he killed people to line his own pockets and his friends' pockets. And so in his diaries, he sets out how he's going to murder various abbots of various monasteries because he wants to take their wealth. And it's a detailed process. He lines up the witnesses, he arranges the judges, and then he writes, and the verdict will be guilty and they will be taken away and executed. So there's no pretense at a trial there. So on one page, we've got the murder of the Abbot of Glastonbury, which was the most wealthy abbey in the country at the time. And right underneath is the murder of the Abbot of Reading. And, he has no shame about it. I mean, this is state murder, and he can get away with it because there's no one to stop him.
Unbelievable. On the flip side as well, just scooting along, Queen Victoria's diaries are listed here. What do they reveal about her?
Well, they're amazing. And the originals are in Windsor Castle. Obviously, they're sort of handwritten. But it's many, many, many volumes. And she was a very consummate diarist. She wrote down everything and very personal things, her personal reflections. So, covering most things in her reign, but the things that I deal with in the book are obviously her response to Rorke's drift, but also her responses to the Great Exhibition of 1851. And she's fascinated to see all these people coming up to London from all the different shires, package holidays arranged by Mr. Thomas Cook. That's when he started, and then, all these people come up and they drink nice fizzy things from the fountain by Mr. Schweppes. But she's absolutely amazed at these entire sort of villages who come up, often organised by the local priest or by some local figure, and they're all in their Sunday finery, and they come up and they see these great, how Britain is leading the world at the Great Exhibition with all these inventions. And she went dozens of times herself. She was a colossal fan of it all. So we deal with that. And then we also deal with, she kept quite detailed notes, and she was following the Jack the Ripper murders, which obviously absolutely rocked London at the time. Nobody had seen anything quite so horrific. And the newspapers then were much less restrained than they are now. And if you read the contemporary reports, they really were horrific. accounts, and they went into real details, and it was desperately unpleasant reading, and obviously horrific events. But she comments on this, and she gets really cross, and she writes the police and says, "You lot are utterly incompetent. Have you done this? Have you done that? You need to keep me updated. I want to know what's going on here." And she makes suggestions about places they should search and things that might be going on. And even when she goes away and she's up in Balmoral, she's still sending cipher telegrams, staying very close to this, and really, really despondent about the way the police are handling it.
How interesting. Who'd have thought that Queen Victoria was some kind of amateur sleuth? Really interesting. Thank you. That's Dominic Selwood, and his book, A History of British Identity in 50 Objects, is out now.